Alright, who is the author? Why did he die? Is he dead? Who killed him? Most of all, why should anybody possibly care? All of those are questions that are sort of answered in this very interesting essay by Roland Barthes, a literary critic and theorist. Unfortunately French, but we moved. Still have some valid points. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Le Mort de l'auteur, The Death of the Author, which is his 1967 essay, which criticises the way that literary criticism itself has been developed for the whole of time, and basically, changes it, some would say. He answers this very question, why has the author died? In this essay, even though it's quite a short essay, it's very easy to read. It's a little bit dense because it's literary criticism, but it's good. And the whole essay is interesting. The only reason you should ever consider reading it is because it goes against traditional orthodoxy and the traditions of this profession that he's a part of. It argues against literary criticism's practice of relying on the intentions, the biography, the history of an author in order to find some ultimate meaning. So, the thing your English teacher would always do, you get a piece of work, and then before you analyse it, you get the biography, the history of the author. So that means your English teacher tells you Shakespeare didn't like the Queen, right? So therefore, when your teacher runs you through this passage in Othello or something, you analyse the whole theme of regicide or something. I don't know. I never did Othello. I did Romeo and Juliet GCSE. But you get my point. You use the author's life to determine the ultimate meaning of the text. And he is arguing against that. So that is standard criticism. This essay is tearing the whole thing down. So the Roland Barthes critique is essentially that the reader, that's you, has primacy, not the author. The essay emphasizes the importance of the individual reader's interpretation of any work over the single definitive meaning that's ascribed to it by history, by the author, or by people's view of the author. It's quite a weird thing to be mad about for him, but it's actually really interesting when you read it, because it's a big deal, right? His essay is saying you are the one that decides, not the author, not a teacher telling you about the author, not a literary critic. It is the author, it's the reader's interpretations that are most important. There is no suggestion, to be clear, having read the essay, that we should ignore any writer's attempts to frame a story or where a writer came from. He's not saying ignore the entire history of a person. Instead, he's arguing for primacy, right? For the reader to be put forward in the driving seat of interpretation, and that primacy should return, or should I say, leave, from the author to the reader. He's basically like arguing for a power shift in terms of who has power over how a work is interpreted, right? Is it a literary critic, or is it the reader themselves, each individual reader? Which is, it's quite a big thing when you think about it like that, especially considering he's writing 1967, so way earlier. Generates a little bit of controversy, as could be expected, because he's going against the norms of a whole tradition. And most interestingly, I guess you could say most interestingly, there's some other examples, but the really big one is Michel Foucault in 1968, who does a series of lectures. Actually, he starts in 1968, and then they run to 1969, which are titled "What is an Author?" So, 67, Death of the Author from Roland Barthes. 69, when it really kicks off, is Michel Foucault, What is an Author? And you can see the direct line there, right? He is replying to Roland Barthes' criticism. And there, in those lectures, in 1969, Foucault brings out the idea of author function to explain the author as the deciding force, right? or as he calls it, the classifying principle within a particular discursive formation. Kind of had to look up what on earth a discursive formation is, so I don't really get it. But the closest I could get was that it's just the system of rules that govern the way that stuff, ideas, papers, writing, all of writing, within a particular field is circulated. So the rules around circulation of ideas. That's essentially what a discursive formation is. And Foucault says discursive formation should be controlled by the author. To kind of summarize it. Back to the main point. Foucault does not mention Barthes by name at all in the essay, but it's pretty clear from his analysis, and from the title most of all, and the fact it's coming 2 years later, that it's a challenge to Barthes' depiction of a historical and almost like heroic process in Barthes' view, by which the reader has finally been freed from the domination of the author. Very, very dramatic, I know. It's very strange. Alright, let's cut that. I think the most interesting part about the whole essay, let's cut that. The most interesting part about Barthes' criticism is maybe not the fact that he's arguing for more focus on the reader, which is a big shift in itself, but how passionately he argues. This is not like a geeky essay about literary criticism, even though it is. But the way it's styled is not that at all. It's much more passionate. The language is grandiose and dramatic, including the title in original French, and it all carries it's got this inherent drama to it, the way he speaks. Barthes sees the literary criticism and literary critics as within this struggle that's both historical and titanic to free the reader. That's how he describes it. He sees the author as this controlling empire and seeks to free the reader from it. And to do this, he constantly personifies the author throughout the essay. So within the title and within the essay, it's capitalized as the author, not a vague blob, but a singular entity. One paragraph begins with, though the author's empire is still very powerful, and continues on later to say that surrealism helps secularize the image of the author. So the second part of that, surrealism helping secularize the image of the author, is interesting because again it plays into the drama. The religious themes here, they crop up again and again throughout the pretty short essay, and Barthes is railing against the way that he sees authors of having been treated, as if their writing is this theological work that has to be taken in one way. It has to be like a papal doctrine that has to be interpreted in one way with careful scholarship, and that's the way. He later says, we know a text does not consist of a line of words, releasing a single theological meaning, but is a space of many dimensions. So that perfectly sums up his view, right? Writing for him is not something that is a work of art that is interpreted in one single way, but in a theological sort of setting of people gathering over it. The high priest decide what this text means. He sees it as, many dimensional space in which individual readers play out their own ideas and interpret it in their own ways. Throughout the whole thing, you get the sense that this is a very personal and passionate project for Barthes. This is his life goal, right? The way he's speaking. And it's that engaging emotion throughout the whole thing that makes the essay, interesting to read. Because kind of a dry subject inherently, but the way he speaks makes it particularly interesting. Even basically half a century on. More importantly, it has a massive impact on culture and literary criticism. As you can see from the fact Foucault responds within 2 years. And the most interesting part, he's kind of proven right. Like, within history now, the process he describes, he sees this as a historical progression, being freed from the tyranny of the author. And he's kind of right. With the way books are interpreted today, with, cancel culture, with books being more accessible than ever, with authors more under the spotlight, he's kind of right. Nowadays we would rail against the fact that some person gets to decide the ultimate interpretation of this text based on an author's lived experience. people nowadays are much more in Barth's point of view of it's a multi-dimensional text, individual interpretations, primacies of the reader. You know, people today are much more with Barth than people were back then in 1967. And that includes the modern editing process, right? Nowadays there's so much editing that will go into a book, and Barth would say, you know, this is a key part of the process. People reacting to books publicly is a part of the book itself. So whilst he might be pretty controversial, very antagonistic, history, I think, has treated him pretty kindly compared to how maybe his contemporaries did, and especially compared to how his contemporaries might have expected him to be treated. So, you know, if you want to, go read The Death of an Author by Roland Barthes, because why not?